1700 is in Spain. You have the king and the queen and all the palace. And there was nothing on their, there was no decorations in terms of their palace. And so they found an artist who was deaf and came in and did the work in the palace. And when they realized that he was deaf, I mean, it made them feel good. Like they felt like deaf people could actually do and be successful. So as we go on in the 1700s, we have Germany and then we have France. Now France had the deaf school that used sign language. Germany was a very oralistic approach, and it was run by hearing people. France also was run by hearing people, but they worked with the deaf people. So you have the two. Now you have access to information, education. And the world started looking at them and copying some of these approaches. The oralist method, the sign language, and they brought that here to America. And that was probably about 150 years ago that they actually set up the deaf school, and it was through Laird. And he was a professor, he used sign language, and he taught there. Now Germany, their influence was the oralistic approach. And that started actually coming through, and people started to use the oral method. The American Indians, they have many tribes all over the place. And they may look all the same, but within themselves, as an Indian, on the outside they look the same, but on the inside they may be different. Same thing with us. We use different communication approaches. And we have that access to information. And our community has to work together, which empowers our community. With ASL, you have the language and the facial expression. A lot of people go through and they don't have really great English skills, and they still feel oppressed. But with William Stokey, he was a linguist, and he actually did research, and he discovered that ASL is a language. And through his research, he discovered that, and then people started feeling really good about their language. And deaf people knew that ASL was their language, but they didn't quite know about the deaf culture. Now we have vocational rehab counselors, teachers, printers, and at that time we had a very limited opportunity in terms of work. Now deaf people, because they have more access to information, they're going to school, they're educated, they're going to college, they're well equipped. And they know exactly what is going on. So that's what information sharing does when you get involved with that. Now ASL culture, I'm going to hold off on that and not go too much right now. Okay. Now we're going to move on to Gallaudet. What was Gallaudet established for? What was it founded for? Education. It's the only liberal arts college for the deaf in the world. Okay? And it was there for 124 years, and it never had a deaf president. People would graduate, they'd go to other colleges, get their master's degree, their PhDs. And honestly, I'm sure that it's been billions of dollars by now. Just in various methods, there's been all this money. They put all this money together just to get deaf people ready to go out into the real world so that they can function out in the world. Okay, all these points will tie together. How many of you love math? I know you love math. Yeah? Probability. Probability. You think, ooh, many deaf people have degrees and, know, they run the deaf schools, and they have positions, and they're comfortable within those positions. But when you go through and you screen, you come down to, you know, they ended up with 6 hearing, 6 deaf. And then they went from that down to 3. And then they made a recommendation to the Gallaudet for 2 deaf and 1 hearing. This was Ike and Jordan. This was Harvey Corson. And a woman here by the name Zinzer. Okay, so you have 2 deaf, 1 hearing. So, well, you know, if you look at all the statistics, you can be pretty sure that, okay, that would pick a deaf president. The time is right. It would be a great return of investment. And that's what the people wanted. And I was a good boy, okay? I was not like Larry at that time. I was kind of studying. I looked out the window, and there was all these people, and I was like, oh, what's happening? You know, and everybody down there was angry. And they were like, this is the first woman to leave Gallaudet University, and they were angered by that. You know, we wanted a deaf person, but Zinger happened to be a hearing woman, and the two deaf people happened to be men. And the hearing people still decided for us. They went back to 300 BC, Aristotle time, and used that perception of deaf people when they made that decision. And at that point, you know, I wasn't aware of what was actually going on, but knew that there was a good probability that it would be a deaf. So I went to my ex-wife's room at that time, and I called my Gramps, my grandfather. And I was typing on the TTY to him, and I told him what happened, and I said, we have to go, we have to protest. Okay, and I have a family of 4 generations of deaf people that fight for deaf rights. And most of them are from New Jersey, and they fight for deaf people's rights. Like Columbia University didn't have any interpreters. And my Gramps actually graduated there with a degree, but he still had to fight for his rights there. And he told me, don't do this, respect your elders. And I can't speak for most, but yes, you should respect your elders. He said, respect your elders no matter what. And I'm sure he's thinking, my grandson is hopeless, he's just mischievous, and yes, he's right. So I decided, no, I'm going to go ahead, we're going to go with this protest. And we went to the Mayflower Hotel, and the reason is the board made the decision and made the announcement there. They didn't want to make the announcement in front of everybody. They actually did it through a paper system. We had to get a demonstration permit for the protest. And once we got started, their view of, oh, all these deaf people, wow, protesters. And at that time, we were marching through, and there were police officers. We had some pretty large police officers with megaphones, and they're all talking to us, and we keep running. And they're like, this is not working. As we kept marching, and I learned from Charles Estes, I kind of learned, I mean, what I saw and what other people were seeing. And the police there, as we continued to march, you know, they decided we have to block these people. We have to prevent them from going on. So it was kind of a blessing in disguise. They were really there to protect us, not really to stop us, but to help us get there safely. So when we arrived to the hotel, a few of us went up and we met with Spillman president of the board at that time, Bill Gravin. He was on the search committee, and we sat down and met with them. And Jeff Rosen, and Greg Leibach, and we asked them, okay, why did this happen? And Spillman, he tried to explain, you know, about, well, some of the experience with the legislative, and the chancellor of the university, and the ability to get funding. And a deaf person couldn't actually function in a hearing world. And she said that. And that line, that comment just really hit me. You know, and I wondered, okay, was that interpreted right? I didn't have any idea. So I said, okay, whether it was right or not, I went ahead, went down, and I felt like, you know, that comment of deaf people cannot function in a hearing world, that goes back to 300 BC. That's the perspective of that. You know, can they not see that deaf people are graduating from universities? So war kind of broke out at that point. For the next 2 days, there was a lot going on, and we finally came up with 4 demands. The first one was a deaf president. The second one was 51% of the board being deaf. The third one was to get rid of Spillman because of her saying that deaf people couldn't function in a hearing world. And then no repercussions.
What really helped was, on that Wednesday night, Zinzer was obstinate. We had met the 4 student leaders. We met with her, and King Jordan and Zinzer, they were in the private hotel. There was police cars there, and it's like the board, we were trying to work with you to learn about deaf culture and sign language in 3 or 4 months. You can learn, yes, in that short time frame, but not at all to be fluent. I mean, you had to be deaf to really understand. That was a big no. And then Ted Koppel that night, there was Greg Bilbach and myself, and then Marty Matlin was there, and Zinzer. We were all on the television being interviewed. And Ted Koppel, in the interview, are you a puppet? Are you following the Board of Trustees' decision to stay? She has a mind of her own, though. Were you being a puppet? And that really changed the dynamics. And at that moment, she decided to resign. So 3 of the demands now were left. We weren't sure yet if we were going to have a deaf president. We didn't know if we had to start the whole motion process at that point. So the congressional people were supporting us. They provided us the financial support and the backup, and we got very clear that there were going to be 4 deaf people because of all this mix-up and misunderstandings with the board. So deaf and hearing people convened together to garner support. And they had the African American community there, Gallaudet was there, and they were looking at us. The majority of us were Caucasian, they were there. But during that particular time, we learned that we were definitely oppressed, and that others had also gone through similar oppression. So during that march was a big national march up to the Capitol, and some 50,000 people joined with us, along with their families, from the African American community. That was the heart of it that incited change. And so at the culmination of all this, we were just worn out, and in that evening, now this, mind you, had been going on for a week. This was the 7th day. You know, God created the earth on the 7th day. Well, the same principle applied here. This was the 7th day, and the success of actually presenting King George was not yet announced. We don't know if we were going to have any repercussions or punishment. Is it going to be Spillman? We couldn't, we didn't know the vote yet. 51% majority of the board. I mean, wow. All of the history and the freedom that came from the oppression. We had finally taken over control. There was a lot happening. It was such a blessing. That night, I spoke with my grandfather. And I got on the TTY. My grandfather said, "You are right. I believe it's too good to be true." If you go back in history where it talks about the oralism faction versus sign language and how they were split, that taught me that we work together. So that one night, so there was other student cars at the gates of Gallaudet, and the police were ready to go through the gates, and the buses were lined up, the Gallaudet buses. We were deciding what to do. So we decided to go to the transportation building. And we wanted to break in. We didn't have a key. So a guy that was an oralist, he said, "Come in, I'll help you. I'll hotwire you." And so he was able to jimmy the locks, hotwire the buses. We could see the vision of a deaf president now as a result of working together. So moving on in history, that was only the beginning. The Deaf President Now protest, which means DPN, was the beginning. So deaf people started looking at themselves with increased self-esteem. I'm deaf, I'm proud, I'm not hearing impaired, there's nothing wrong to be deaf, I don't need to be fixed. And Phil Bravin went to the Connecticut School for the Deaf, and there was a theatrical performance there, little kids presenting a performance. And as they were on stage, one of them said, "I want to be President of the United States." A little girl of mine said this. That was her vision. That was awesome. I mean, think of that. It was, too good to be true, so to speak. The ADA was brought up. It hadn't passed. It had already been brought up before the protest happened, but the momentum had died down. So something had to be done. So it helped the community, the disability community. And moving back up to the feeling and attitude, before we were perceived as disabled. Well, now we're not. We may feel disabled in the world, but people in our world would feel disabled with the reversal of roles, like using ASL and deaf culture. Imagine, if you will, a hearing person coming to a person that's from Russia that can hear coming to America. People will perceive his English. Will they perceive it as very well? Perhaps not, because he speaks differently. He's learned a second language, that's all. For deaf people, often, our language is beautiful. From a hearing perspective, hearing people often think that we have to be fixed to fit their world. They don't understand our language, and that we're adopting English as a second language, which is not visual. So good things happened as a result of the 300 BC for the volcano to come up, so to speak. So more and more job opportunities have come up for deaf people in the communication field, telecommunications. Bob Davila, selected by President Bush to be first Secretary of the Department of Education, and then also special education. Bob Davila was over that department. And $54 billion were budgeted for his department. That president now was clearly very clear to the hearing community. So how many of you may have heard of the recent Gallaudet protest? Where's Ron Taylor? I promised to show here. Okay. If you could come up here. Yes. I'm going to ask you a question. You know, last May, what was your first reaction when you heard about the protest? Yeah, come up forward out of the light. About the situation at Gallaudet, were you thinking, is there going to be a protest or not? What was your first consideration, your first reaction? My first reaction was, oh gosh, DPN all over again. But I wasn't keeping up with what was happening there, so I was sort of in the dark, I was lost. I wasn't there physically, I was in Texas, so I felt lost. So I started looking for information on the internet. And some people were catching me up on what was going on, and I looked at the video blogs and got information that way. So basically, your initial reaction was to support that protest, or, well, initially, JK is deaf. She's not here, and I thought, well, she's deaf. Not culturally deaf, but I thought, okay, well, Jane Fernandez is deaf, so why are they against her? I didn't understand that. So I realized my problem was I didn't have enough information. Great, thank you. Let's have one more person come up. Let's see their response. Same question, Ronnie. So last May, what was your initial response on news of the protest? Well, I remember hearing, I thought, oh, this is silly. That was my first response. I was like, come on. This is a deaf person they've selected as a president here. I was puzzled. I thought, this person's not deaf enough, that's what they were saying. Or, so then later, through the FSAA, I started understanding more, but initially I thought, this is silly. Okay, that was my reaction too when I first saw it. I thought, we're going to go through this again because I didn't understand that. I thought she was deaf. I was out of touch with Gallaudet. I didn't understand it. And so through that process, the bottom line was, I think if I could jump here a moment. Let me go through this because I do have another reason, another reaction that I want to go through. The universities collectively have a provost committee. And how that works is most of the faculty serve on those provost committees. And they make recommendations, and of course the president has the final decision for that process. But based on what the committees recommend is more likely going to be decided by the president. So the president works with the faculty. Gallaudet never had that entity set up. The president is the one who initially picks the possible president, and then the faculty has their input. So leading up to this second protest, at that time, people were in fear that they didn't want to work with her because they felt like that she would be not acting as like the provost before, but once elected, they felt there was a fear of intimidation. So many faculty did not want to work for her. 80% of the faculty did not. The Alumni Association and various organizations were against that recommendation. The university is the only university in the world with a deaf board. And if we have 3 to 6 different Gallaudet universities all over the nation. Imagine, if you will, for a moment, each with their own respective names. Would they start listening to the consumers better? There would be competition. The board would be going after the consumers to bring them on board. Because now we need to be treated as customers. It's the only liberal arts college run by a deaf board, with deaf persons running that board. So there's a big problem here. If you really treat the customer, will it bring in more students? Will it be good publicity? If the answers maybe would be yes, yes, and yes. I really can't answer that. But if there was 2 more Gallaudet universities, we may be in a better position to fight for the love that we have for Gallaudet.
Okay, moving on to the next slide. This is some of what you heard just recently. The first thing we thought was, oh, come on, the person's deaf. Let's go. What's the point? It's a leader, you know. What is enough deafness? Nobody wanted her. 80% of the faculty didn't want her. You know, if people felt good and wanted that person to lead us, then that would be one thing. But, you know, the provost committee felt like they had to be the bad cops in that situation. And, you know, to help us understand that position, and I felt like there were more concerns. You know, again, we had to look at it and say, again, you know, we already did DPN. Do we have to protest again? Another factor is that you have to understand that the president may be different than the community they serve, but they have to represent everyone. And we, you know, if the leader's hard of hearing and some people are oral, it wouldn't matter what their exact history is and how that would represent. You know, if that was an oral person or a hard of hearing person, would that represent the deaf community culturally? There was a small number of protesters starting at the beginning, and Gallaudet's PR machine was non-existent. It was really working against the deaf community. And there was one point, Gallaudet University board, the board forgot in their search, and some of us forgot it too. DPN was very clear. But at that time, we didn't have pagers. We didn't have text capability or internet. So information that was sent out was very limited. So people had to come to campus to access information about what was going on. So we had a mass group in force. However, in the current climate of technology, text messages were sent out, blogs were posted, video cameras were seen. It was well publicized. That means more people were watching that situation than the first protest at Gallaudet DPN in 1988. So people were waiting for the news, and they would see news happen. And you know, previously, it was a very long process to pass communication on from one person to the next, from one TTY call to the next. But we could see this information in mass. However, if we wouldn't have had this text capability, we may have seen a different kind of response. It's hard to say. If you remember Friday, October 13th, there was a situation where King Jordan said that, you know, as a university, we're going to work with the students. And the students said, you're still not listening. And King Jordan said, let's move forward. Let's arrest everyone. And there came a point where on the streets, the police had gathered, the police cars were parked. And if you imagine going to France or the Tale of Two Cities a long time ago when people used the guillotine and they would be beheaded, and people had to line up and be beheaded one right after the other. You know, after all those years and all that time and all this history, they were going to arrest us as students. You know, and I felt like, you know, I had no trust for our leaders after that they saw us as criminals at that point. And small groups of people were gathering and they tried to arrest them, and this group was well bonded. And that's when so many of the blogs started spreading and information was sent out. And that night, servers crashed because people were sending so much technical information online. And all that message was sent across the United States, and there was an immediate reaction. It went to this extreme. This situation was crazy, and yet the board did nothing. Have you seen the movie with Hugh Hefner in the plane where, you know, in that movie it's just like Michael Jordan. Anyway, okay, let's go back. As I said before, if we only had one deaf university compared to several deaf universities, people would have to compete for business for their customers. They would see us as consumers of their services and try and take care of us. And with one university, there's a different perspective. And we realized at that point, these decisions cannot be left to the board. We must be in contact with the consumers of this service. And we want to respect the people that they put in, but the president has to earn our trust and our respect and our support. We do not have to accept that person, and we were told we did have to accept whoever they put on as president. After a short time, we might choose to support that person, but you cannot tell us we have to support that person immediately. If the provost search committee happened, would Jane Fernandez be in that position? I mean, don't get me wrong, the point is that we have to become more involved, and we have to be responsible to keep in contact. Even though we're not there, we have to watch what's happening. And we have to make sure that, you know, we're empowered to empower those at Gallaudet to make sure the right things are happening. When Bob Davila took over, that was very powerful. And going back to 300 BC and the oppression and the dehumanization we had at that time compared with now, where we learned about our language and we learned about our culture, and we, you know, fought against each other as different forces and factions within our language modes, to go along now to the University at Gallaudet and the protest, I think that we have gotten great opportunities because of that. But don't forget, there are different ideas and limited access to information still. This confirms that we're still alive. It's still a process. We want to be the best leaders possible, and we want to be led by the best. It wasn't that bad after all. Okay, so here we are. You know, I want to thank you for listening and ask you if you have any questions for me.